hello, 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 check 1 2, 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 hello, 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 hello. Hello, hello, hello. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, check 1 2, check 1 2. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, 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 check 1 2. Hello, hello, check 1 2, check 1 2, check 1 2, check 1 2, check 1 2. Hello, 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 hello. हेलो 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 हाँ हेलो 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 क्या प्रॉब्लम हो रहा है हेलो 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 ड्यूरेशन ना भल अच्छी तो ये नया बैटरी डाला था सर हाँ पोलैरिटी चेंज किया हुआ था चेंज ठीक किया किसका इसका ऑन हुआ नहीं नहीं सर पोलैरिटी चेंज ही नहीं है ऑन किया नहीं तो सही तो लगा है ऑन कर ऑन ऑन हेलो 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 क्या हेलो हेलो आप बंद करो जी 5 बजे राइट एग्जाम कैंपस इसको बंद कर दिए तो हेलो वो नहीं चाहिए ये नहीं चाहिए नहीं हेलो 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 सर 5 नंबर में कुछ प्रॉब्लम हो रहा है सर हेलो 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 गेन इतना है सर इसका हेलो 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 माइक चेंज किया तब भी हाँ माइक चेंज किया तब भी देखिए इसमें तो गेट कंप्रेसर कुछ डाला भी नहीं हेलो 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 क्लिप कर रहा है सर क्लिप कर रहा है लेकिन हेलो 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 लेकिन क्लिप कर रहा है लेकिन आवाज नहीं आ रहा है हाँ हेलो 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 ये सही से कनेक्टेड है हेलो 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 एक्सएलआर केबल भाई ये वाला तो रख ये वाला रख दीजिए और एक दे रहा है हेलो 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 ये देखो ना এটা ক্লিপ করছে हेलो 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 चेंज कर दो हेलो 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 ये गेस्ट पकड़ के बोलेंगे ना टेबल पे रहेगा जिसके हाथ हेलो 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 ये वाला स्टूडेंट के लिए रख लो ना उनको फिर सुनाई नहीं देगा ना क्वेश्चन सुनाई नहीं देंगे स्टूडेंट को बोल दें होल्ड इट क्लोजली सुनो उसको रखो सिर्फ फादर के लिए फादर मैक्सिमम वो नहीं करते वो चलेगा ये राजे उनको दे दो कि वो मैक्सिमम ये करे स्टूडेंट को कोई करेगा कि पाखुर धरो स्टूडेंट को फादर उनको भैया पाखुर नहीं हाँ इस इन दो माइक का रेंज अच्छा पकड़ रहा है वो दोनों को स्टूडेंट दे देंगे इसको स्टूडेंट को जी माइक नहीं कि धरेइबो से कहि दबो कि अरे सब
Everybody, please be seated. We'll just begin shortly.
Hello, hello.
Everybody, please be seated. We'll just begin shortly. Students at the back, please be seated. Very good evening, everyone. Respected Chief Guest, Dr. Naushad Forbes, Co-Chairman Forbes Marshall, Shri Rajiv Kaul, Chairman Board of Governors, Dr. Father Paul Fernandes, Vice Chancellor Xavier University and Director XIMB, members of the staff, faculty, members from the media, and students. I, Sampriti Mahanti, on behalf of XIMB XUB, welcome you to the 15th Foundation Day Lecture. This year, we are extremely proud to host Dr. Naushad Forbes, Co-Chairman Forbes Marshall, India's leading steam engineering and control instrumentation firm. He chairs the steam engineering companies within the group. We are indeed delighted to have you amongst us, sir. We have with us this evening Shri Rajiv Kaul, Chairman, Board of Governors, XIMB XUB. Welcome you, sir. We are indeed happy to welcome our Vice Chancellor and Director, Dr. Father Paul Fernandes. Welcome, Father. Now we begin this evening with a prayer sung by the choir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kaur, for the beautiful invocation. May I now request Sri Rajiv Kaul, Chairman, Board of Governors, XIMB, XUB, to introduce the chief guest and speaker for the day and deliver the welcome address.
Our respected chief guest and my very dear friend, Dr. Naushad Forbes, my colleagues on the Board of Governors of both XIMB and Xavier's University, Father Paul Fernandez, Vice Chancellor and Director of XUB and XIMB respectively, members of the faculty, our bright young students, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is with the greatest of pleasure that I extend a warm welcome to all of you for this Foundation Day lecture. A very special welcome, of course, goes out to our chief guest, Dr. Naushad Forbes, who I have been fortunate to have as a friend for the past several years. He is an exceptional individual who I have had the good fortune to work and admire whilst we were together at CII. I think all of you are aware that he has just retired as the national president of CII, where he did yeoman service, not just to CII members, but indeed to our country as a whole. Naushad has the rare distinction of having received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees from Stanford University, one of the best universities in the world. He went on to teach there as well, and I think he is a regular visiting professor. So in a way, he is one of our fraternity in terms of faculty. He's on the boards of many institutions, and it's really a pleasure to have him, because he is a leader with a very clear vision. He is a leader who builds confidence and consensus. He is a leader who inspires. He is a leader with the highest level of integrity, a leader who contributes a great deal to society and also the nation, and above all, a leader who is full of humility. May I therefore request all of you to join me in giving our chief guest a warm welcome, which our university and institute is known for. Welcome, Naushad. It's such a pleasure to have you with us. And without any further ado, can I request you to deliver your inaugural address or your Foundation Day address. Over to you, Naushad.
Thank you, Chief. Thanks. Members of the governing board, and especially my friend Rajiv Kaul, Father Paul Fernandez, Vice Chancellor, members of the faculty, fellow students, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is a pleasure and a privilege for me to be with you today. It is a particular pleasure to be with you in Bhubaneswar at Xavier's. Thank you, Rajiv and Father Paul, for the kind invitation to deliver this year's lecture. I thought I'd talk this evening, and thank you, Rajiv, for that very embarrassing invitation. I was saying to Father Paul while you were saying it that if I hadn't heard all of it, I wouldn't have known who you were talking about. I thought I'd talk this evening about the future of Indian industry and the role of managers in the future of Indian industry. And I hope that these prepared remarks lead us to having a good discussion after. As soon-to-be managers, you can join in the great opportunity that presents itself to us in Indian industry today. And in particular, I think your activities as managers can make our opportunities as a country even greater. This starts, it seems to me, by making the right career choices. Having a management degree or a graduate degree of any kind is a privilege. It means that one automatically has options and opportunities that are distinct and attractive. So these words on career choices are for those like you who have the privilege of these options. I believe very strongly that one must enjoy what one does. This to me is an absolute. If you don't enjoy your work, change what you do. Too many of us choose fields of study and choose careers because someone tells us they are good to do. Within an MBA, finance and marketing always seem to be the most chosen of fields. And driving here with Professor Ghosh this afternoon, I understand that XIMB is no exception. Finance and marketing are the two preferred choices. They are fine fields, but there are others too. Operations, technology, HR, which are as exciting. The same for career choice, for company choice. Choosing a good company is very important, but look beyond the name to the content of the job. As students of management, you will all be familiar with the theory of motivation, which I'm sure is still taught in the program. Just to remind you, factors split into motivation factors and hygiene factors. Money is a hygiene factor. If you don't have it, you will be dissatisfied, but if you do have it, you may still not be satisfied. Satisfaction requires motivation, and the most enduring motivation factor is the content of the job itself. To that, I would add the kind of people that one works with on a daily basis. If those two are right, if one works with good people whose company one enjoys, and if the content of the job is such that the work is challenging and one learns all the time, then that will provide its own reward. Second, to me it is important to make a difference. If you are one of 500 or 1,000 professionals recruited each year into a company, the chances of making a difference are more limited. That, to me, is the single big reason that manufacturing companies have some advantage over IT companies. For our IT services business, people are the product. So recruiting more and more people is the way that they grow, at least until now. Even the largest manufacturing companies recruit dozens of professionals each year, not hundreds and certainly not thousands. So the chance of standing out, the chance of making a difference is that much greater. It also matters where one works. Until some years ago, as Rajiv mentioned, I used to teach a course each year at Stanford. I loved the course, the university, and the teaching. And people used to ask me which I enjoyed more, teaching at Stanford or working in Pune. And my answer was always that while I enjoyed the teaching very much, I knew that regardless of how much people liked my course, it made very little difference to the university. Stanford was a great university before I got there, and if it had never heard of me, it would still be a great university. I felt, though, that working in India, I made more of a difference in our company, in industry in general, in the society around me. Perhaps that was just my ego speaking, but I felt and I feel that I make a difference here, and that makes it worthwhile. Let me continue this argument of working in India. When I first started working here 30 years ago, in 86-87, we lived in an India that was stuck. The Economist did a survey of the Indian economy in June 1991, in which it said, nowhere in the world is the gap between what might have been achieved and what has been achieved as great as it is in India. That is a very sobering statement, right? Nowhere in the world is the gap between what might have been achieved and what has been achieved as great as it is in India. Isn't it great that in these 26 plus years, so much has changed that today no one could make that same statement. So in all the press coverage of NPAs and bank recapitalization and crony capitalism and the true agenda of the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, I think it is good to remind ourselves of an India that has been uncaged and an India that has very much been moving in the right direction. Let me illustrate what we've achieved and how much we are still to achieve by telling you a couple of quick stories and then talking about the future of Indian industry and your potential role in it as a management graduate in this future. The first story is about someone who works as a security guard at our factory. And he said with great pride that his son had graduated as an engineer and gone to work for GE, and his daughter had qualified as a doctor and started work in a hospital. So within a year, this family had gone from a monthly income of around 15,000 rupees a month to a family income of over $1.5 lakh a month. That is what has been driving our growth forward over these last 25 years, as more and more people follow the example of this security guard. As you may know, consumption contributes over 60% of India's GDP growth. And our growth achievement of 7% on average over the last 25 years is a story of growth in consumption capacity with more and more people included in our growth process. This growth is real, it is widespread, and it has 30 years still to run. Now, this security guard is not unique. There are hundreds of thousands like him. But he is also not typical, as there are many millions of Indians who aspire to go through the same process. This, to me, is our development challenge. How do we create opportunity for all 1.3 billion of our population? I will return to this topic at the end of the talk. Another story is about a member of our Forbes Marshall board, Hans Gass, who used to be the managing director of a Swedish company called Sandvik in Pune. Before coming to Sandvik, Hans was the MD of Sandvik's French company, and after he retired, he and his wife returned to live in France, where they still live. Hans has worked in Switzerland, South Africa, Sweden, France, and India. But he sees his time in India as the most rewarding of his career. Here's why. He says that in France, the top questions at work were, where was one going for one's holiday that year? Could one stop work at 3 p.m. on Friday so that one could get a slightly longer weekend? How could one get an extra week of vacation in the year? In India, the conversation was always about how the quality of the Indian factory was now second only to Japan and better than Sweden, about how one could start exporting to yet a new territory, about a new product line that would be made there for the first time. Where would one rather work? Last year, as Rajiv mentioned, I had the privilege of serving as the president of the Confederation of Indian Industry, succeeding many great past presidents, such as your own illustrious chairman, Rajiv. It was a wonderful year, especially because of exactly the two elements I mentioned earlier. First, I had the opportunity of working with the many wonderful people who make up the CII Secretariat, from Chandrajit Banerjee, the Director General, to the youngest, rawest, most recent recruit. You cannot find a group of people more committed, more loyal, and more caring. It was a pleasure to be their colleague. Second, the content of the work itself. CII defines itself as a development institution, and its concern is national development. Contributing whatever I could and can to this broad purpose of national development is a great privilege, involving much learning, and it involved using my abilities to the maximum. It was also a lot of fun. I'd like to spend the rest of my time talking about the future of Indian industry and on how you, as soon-to-be management graduates, can help deliver this future for Indian industry. Let me begin with an assertion. The strength of the Indian economy rests in its private sector. Whenever we discuss Indian development, the obvious comparison is always with that other giant, China. Whenever I've visited China, I've always been struck by the role of the government there. It truly leads the economy, investing in infrastructure in a massively impressive way, identifying new sectors for its public and private sectors to invest in, investing in building institutions for education and research. I've also been struck on visits to China how everyone says the same thing. Whether you speak to someone in the government in Beijing, an academic or a businessman, and wherever in the country, you hear the same thing, the same priorities, the same challenges, the same tasks underway. This alignment may all sound very positive to you, but as an Indian, I find it quite unnerving. Far from a scenario where someone from the government and someone from the private sector says the same thing, I am used to the difficulty of finishing any sentence beginning with the words, Indian industrialists believe that. I used to struggle with this all through last year, that if you tried to actually speak for Indian industry, you had to be very clear that you were sometimes only speaking for a small part of Indian industry, and then work to try and include more and more Indian industrialists in that coverage of who one was supposedly representing. It is this diversity of opinion that makes Indian industrialists resilient, entrepreneurial, and independent. And just as I am uncomfortable with the conformity of China, I am much more comfortable with our diversity in India. A diversity of communities, religions, ethnicities, opinions, and arguments that makes us easily the world's most diverse country. In my closing speech as CII president, I described myself as a Parsi from Pune who struggles to speak Hindi, eats beef, and reads P.G. Wodehouse, and is a proud Indian. This diversity underlies our vibrant and noisy democracy. If you ask me, we should oppose anyone who tries to make us conform to a narrower definition of what it means to be Indian. Our diversity is a huge strength. We can use our diversity to lead the world in economic progress, in cultural achievement, and in building the kind of society where people from all corners of the earth will want to live. So given Indian industry's diverse strengths today, how must we be different in the future? I think we must be more of four things. We must be more ethical, we must be more international, we must be more technology-focused, and we must be more collaborative as good corporate citizens. A sentence or two about each of these. First, Indian industry, 5 or 10 years out, must be more ethical. The bulk of companies already are, but there are too many stories of crony capitalists that destroy the image of Indian industry and with it our credibility. In CI, we've launched several initiatives that emphasize the journey all industry must undertake to become more ethical. For example, we have a voluntary code that lets firms move at their own pace, but in an aligned direction, consistent, again, with our diversity. And since idealism goes with the young, I hope as future managers, you will work to make India and Indian industry more ethical. We need it. Second, we must be more international. In CI, we have as a first step identified 120 firms that are aspiring to be multinationals with Indian roots. And we're helping each establish a footprint overseas, using one of the firms as a champion for the others to help get them into particular countries. Again, this is consistent with us being a diverse country. We are not aiming for 3 or even 30 massive multinationals as national champions. We seek, over time, 1,000 firms that are multinationals with Indian roots that represent the strength and the diversity of our entire industrial sector. As future managers, you must play the key role in this process, particularly bringing the right international mindset to how we operate. We need a very internationally minded culture, a culture of learning from the best in the world and then having enough confidence in ourselves to improve that best. Third, we must be more technology focused. Indian industry investment in R&D amounts to 0.3% of GDP against a world average of 1.5%. So we need to increase our investment in technology fivefold to match the world average, to match China, for example, and to develop the proprietary technologies that we can then deploy worldwide. As upcoming managers, you need to play your part in ensuring Indian industry makes the right investments in technology and figures out how to benefit from them, because that will make the process sustainable. Building technical capability is at the heart of the development process. It's actually the field that I used to teach at Stanford. This is well understood worldwide, but it's not adequately yet in India. Bring this understanding to Indian industry. Fourth, we must be more collaborative as good corporate citizens. I started with that story of our security guard, and I said that our security guard illustrated both how much we had achieved, but also how much we are yet to achieve. We need to make his story typical of millions, not of hundreds of thousands, and industry should be, in a combined way, investing in skills and improving the quality of school and college education to bring opportunity to as many as possible of our 1.3 billion. While there is a lot of talk and even some action on skills and education, I feel we are still only scratching the surface, and we need to scale massively. And I think as companies, if we can actually collaborate one with the other and focus our efforts in social areas, specifically on skills and education, to the exclusion of everything else, we can have a serious impact. If we can include more and more of our population in our growth process, we will create wealth for Indian industry for the next 30 years. I was last year at the CI FMCG conclave, and I was struck by some of the data that was presented there. The data that was presented showed how in the first 25 years after 1991, the growth rate of the FMCG industry was roughly twice the growth rate of GDP. In the last 5 years, the growth rate of the FMCG industry has fallen to about the same amount as GDP. So the multiplier has gone from 2 to 1 in this, from 20 years to the last 5 years. And I think that has a large part to do with fewer people being included in the growth process in this last 5 years. And the more as industry we actually get people included in that growth process, the more we will be able to indeed then create opportunity and wealth for all of Indian industry. And indeed, we can create wealth for world industry too for the next 30 years. So including 1.3 billion people in our growth process is a huge challenge. But it is precisely that point, that there is so much to do, so much need everywhere, so much opportunity to contribute at work, in one's community, in one's college, and in one's child's school, that makes it so great to be here in our country at this point in time. So let me close now and then open it up for questions. In my comments on choosing a career, you would have noticed that I didn't talk about money. Money is important, no question. Very few of us are Mother Teresas. For most of us, living a materially pleasurable life is vital to living a pleasurable life in itself. But your degree in management will mean that you are assured of a minimum standard of living, a decent life where meeting basic needs are not in question. And in that freedom, and that freedom gives you, I think, the opportunity to experiment, to do what you love, to make a difference. I hope some of you will choose to make a difference by making Indian industry more ethical, more international, more technology-focused, and more inclusive. But most important is, again, to do what you love. If one does what one loves, then one will do it well and the money usually follows. So if working for an NGO or as a teacher is what will set you on fire, then that's what you should do and be respected for it. If working for a manufacturing company, developing and selling great products is what gives you passion, then that's what you should do and be respected for it. And if being paid the most in your batch to work for McKinsey or some shady financial outfit like Goldman Sachs is what makes you happy, then that's what you should do and be respected for it. But do what you love. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naushad, for your, as usual, brilliant address.
Thanks.
And I'm sure this will lead to a very active
Q&A
session or a dialogue between you and the students. So may I request the first student, they normally are shy at the beginning, but then they get
Then they don't stop.
more aggressive. So
Good.
Who's going to kick off? I think please raise your hand and the mic will reach you.
You know, since I used to once teach, if you don't ask questions, I'll ask you questions. So.
A very good evening, sir. Sir, I have a question for you. Since you have studied in one of the top-notch institutes and you have been a visiting faculty over there, could you please throw some light on some of the best education practices over there, which we could imbibe over here and our students also could learn from it or help from those education practices?
So, yeah. So if you look at the world's great universities, the faculty at the world's great universities will tell you that what makes the difference to those universities is the faculty. But actually, at the end of the day, what makes the difference to the world's great universities is the students. And it's true of every institute worldwide, that at the end of the day, it's the students who make the difference to the culture of the place, to actually forming that spirit of intellectual inquiry on which great education rests. Right? I think, actually, at Xavier's, that you have in the Jesuit tradition a great tradition to live up to in terms of people who study and become faculty out of sheer devotion and passion, people who devote their lives to learning and a deeper understanding of what it means to be truly human. And that underlies then, that forms a foundation on which all learning and all teaching in different fields can build. So what are the practices that I would recommend? Well, the first thing that doesn't make a difference is actually, surprise to surprise, facilities. The difference between a great institute and a less great institute is not how it looks. The difference between a great institute and a less great institute is what happens in exchange between faculty and students, what happens in exchange between student and student, what happens in terms of, you know, the last, okay, so I'll give you a few knots. One more knot. If you're ever told that a question that one has asked is not a serious question because it's not in the syllabus, that's a bad answer, right? Because there's no such thing as a question that should not be in the syllabus. If a question comes to mind, then that question should be answered. Even if one doesn't have the answer, and when I taught my course, I often said, I don't know, but I'll go and find out and tell you. And I think it's important to keep satisfying that human curiosity, which I think every student comes into an institute with. The second thing I would do is learn how to collaborate one with the other. One of the most useful ways in which you learn is, you learn from other students. I would say that as a student at Stanford, I learned from some great faculty, but I learned probably more from even greater students. And so I think learning one from the other, whether it's in formal class settings or coursework or project work, or whether it's just conversations standing around after dinner, you can learn a huge amount from those collaborations. You have the great benefit of a really nice residential campus. And that residential campus gives you a big advantage because it means that all the students are together and you have a lot of time for interaction one with the other. Use it to explore all thoughts. Use it to explore dangerous thoughts. Use it to explore thoughts that you wouldn't dare to explore outside of the safety of the gate. Because that's how you can be creative and that's how you can then push the frontiers of knowledge actually forward.
Thank you so much. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
That was a very nice talk indeed. Thank you very much. Sir, as you aptly said, diversity is what makes India stand out. Now, how would you say that the Make in India movement respects India's diversity?
The Make in India movement?
Yes.
So I think the Make in India movement is meant to foster not just a few companies, not just a few very large enterprises. The Make in India movement has three pieces to it. There's one piece which is of attracting large manufacturing companies to set up shop in India. So attracting Li & Fung, the world's largest clothing manufacturer, or Foxconn, the world's largest electronics manufacturer, to set up shop in India. So one piece is attracting large companies to establish a presence in the country. Well, that's one piece. A second piece is how do we make India an easier place to do business? Today, actually, the World Bank is about to, I think, publish, if they've not done so already, the rankings of the 2017 Ease of Doing Business metrics. And the ease of doing business work is something that will benefit all Indian industry. It will benefit small and large. And ultimately, that's what will sustain interest in India, and that's what will sustain India being an attractive place to do business for Indian firms. Because only if we're an attractive place for Indian firms to invest can we expect India to be an attractive place for foreign firms to invest, right? So the ease of doing business is an extremely important initiative. Everyone's saying that we will see a significant jump in the rankings this year. Sounds good, but if you go around and talk to the average Indian firm, they will tell you that today it's not really easier to do business than it was 3 years ago. It's not more difficult, which, by the way, 3 years ago it was more difficult to do business than it was 3 years before that. So the slide has stopped. But all the improvements we've been making over these last 3 years have been countered by making some things more difficult as well. So I think we need a lot of focus on the ease of doing business, both in the government and from industry associations like CII, to actually deliver that ease of doing business on the ground. Because that's what will make us an attractive place to do business everywhere. The third piece in the Make in India program is actually the cluster program and startups. So what can one do, not just about small and medium-sized firms, but about fostering a much more entrepreneurial culture and fostering and making it easy for people to start firms. A lot of progress in making it easy to start a firm. In fact, that's the one metric on which we've progressed dramatically in the ease of doing business rankings of the World Bank too. Right? But we have a lot more to do in making it easy for small firms that have started to then continue to survive. A lot of work that needs to be done there. And what we'd recommended actually from CII last year was we said, for the first 5 years after a firm starts, first of all, define a startup as any firm that's less than 5 years old. Nothing more, right? Provide zero tax benefits to those firms, right? Instead, let these firms, let any startup operate on the basis of self-declaration. So in all interface with the state, let it operate on the basis of self-declaration and accept whatever is declared by the firm as the truth. Because what we said small firms need and startups need is you need to remove the heavy burden of the state on how a firm operates, a startup which has very few resources. And if we do that, we'll be able to foster actually millions of startups. So those are the 3 pieces of Make in India. And I would say 2 out of those 3 pieces are entirely consistent with diversity, entirely consistent with spreading manufacturing's footprint across the country and across sectors and across entrepreneurs. So I think it's a nice movement that's consistent with our diversity as a country.
Thank you for the insights.
Good evening, sir. I'm Akshay from BM second year. So actually my question is, the companies, manufacturing companies from developed countries, they come to the developing countries or the emerging economies to reduce the production cost and stay competitive over the long period. But many times when they find a new option, they switch to other country. From China coming to India is a new trend. So what should India do to make sure these countries don't move out and stay and operate in India itself for a long period of time? So
the best way of looking at, it used to be called the flying geese model. And the flying geese model was a model of development for Southeast Asia and East Asia. And it started actually with Japan as sort of the lead goose, which developed very rapidly in the 50s and 60s on the back of low labor cost, with a lot of things like toys and electronics and even apparel sourced from Japan. This is the 50s and 60s, not recently. After that, in the 60s and 70s, manufacturing of lower wage items moved to other countries. It moved in particular to South Korea and Taiwan, and even to some extent Hong Kong and Singapore. In the 70s and 80s, it moved again. It moved to Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and then from the 90s onwards, it's basically moved to China. Right? If you look at what's happening now, you see manufacturing of low-wage items moving out of China as Chinese wages rise, but very little is moving to India. A lot more is moving to Vietnam, it's moving to Bangladesh, and to a lesser extent to places like Ethiopia, right? Especially, say, apparel manufacturing. And what we should be doing is making ourselves an attractive place for low-wage manufacturing to actually locate. Let me give you, my big argument would be, say, we're in the state of Orissa. Orissa is one of our poorer states in the country. It's been doing better in the last 10 years, but it's still one of the poorer states in the country. How do we make it attractive for an Indian manufacturer of apparel to set up a factory in Orissa instead of setting it up in Bangladesh? What would it take to do that? It would take probably serious attention to labor reform. It would take, without question, serious attention to some issues of infrastructure, but largely it will take labor reform and then changing the mindset of Indian industrialists so that they start seeing labor-intensive manufacturing as something attractive. Today, if you go around and talk to any of us in any CI meeting, if you say, listen, which companies are actually intending to invest in labor-intensive manufacturing, you will find almost no one. Labor-intensive services, you will find. Labor-intensive manufacturing, you will find almost no one. For various reasons, we've made labor-intensive manufacturing in the country unattractive. We need to make it more attractive. And it's going to take a while. It's going to take 20 years, really, to bring about that change, by which time we should start seeing wages rising everywhere in the country, including in the Northeast and in Orissa and in Bihar and in UP, the states which really require labor-intensive manufacturing as the best way of putting millions of people to work. I think there's one other big opportunity that we have, which is we should look much more at labor-intensive services. If you look at employment, you've heard this phrase, sort of jobless growth, that India's been suffering from jobless growth. It's actually not true. We've created millions of jobs over these last 25 years. The problem is not that we've created millions of jobs, the quantity, but the quality of the jobs we've created. The jobs we've created have been in informal services and in contract labor. They've tended not to be in formal employment opportunities. And formal employment opportunities is where the world understands how to raise productivity. It's where the world understands how you can keep getting wealthier, keep growing wages in those professions. Instead, we've created millions of jobs. The two biggest professions where we've created jobs in the last 25 years are security, so security guards, and drivers. These are the two single professions where we've created millions of jobs. Delhi alone has created 1 million jobs for drivers in the last 20 years, in the last 10 years, and it doesn't show in the employment statistics at all in the country, because each of those drivers is employed by the family that employs them. It doesn't show in any of the data on employment, but we've created 1 million jobs. Not very attractive jobs, not jobs where we know how to raise productivity on an ongoing basis. So we need to figure those things out and think of what does it mean to grow skills in professions like that, in the professions where we are creating millions of jobs, in professions like working in restaurants, in professions like hotels. I mean, what can we do to make Orissa one of the world's great tourist destinations? It has everything else that you need. It has great culture. It has great natural beauty. It has what other countries simply aspire to. So how do we make it attractive for people from first all around the country to come here instead of going to Thailand, which is not that far away?
Good evening, sir. My name is Kajal Agrawal from Business Management first year. I have a question we have seen that the BRICS nation, other than China, have always been complaining about the rating agencies. Like BRICS nation are trying to have their own rating agency. And Indian government though is also criticizing, like the big 3 rating agencies of developed nation are not upgrading our rating. So in the case, if we have our own rating agencies, don't you think we will be having a biased opinion by the new agency that we are trying to create? And what is the need for this agency as such?
Why are the agencies needed? So the agencies are needed largely as a way of enabling people to price debt, right? So they use the ratings. The one serious consequence, apart from the psychological consequence, the serious consequence of a rating is that it enables you to say, okay, what's the risk associated with a particular level of debt? Yeah? So that's the use that's made of the rating that these agencies come out with. Now, do the rating agencies do a thoroughly objective, balanced job? No. However, it's one of those what's the alternative thing. Yeah? Also, sometimes, well, 2 comments. One is, could we have an alternative rating agency that was apparently more balanced, especially to developing countries? Probably so, and that's what's being attempted now. And it's a good idea, because if you have alternative rating agencies that actually end up having forecast risk better, then they will automatically triumph and their ratings will be will have greater credibility in the long run. So it's a good thing to have more rating agencies competing with the existing ones. But the second comment is that sometimes the criticism of rating agencies is always one-sided. When your rating goes up, you repeat it and publicize it. When your rating comes down, then you criticize the agency. So, we should be consistent with how we deal with them. as well. You know, that if we're going to take the rating seriously at any point in time, we have to take it seriously all the time, or we should not take it seriously at any time. I'll give you another rating example. When I was, many years ago, when I was at a time when I was teaching at Stanford, you know, every year the universities are rated. Business Week used to do an annual rating. I think they still do. And the president of Stanford at that time wrote this angry editorial, basically attacking all the rating agencies and systems and the Business Week rankings. And he consistently then would dismiss the ratings regardless of whether Stanford moved up, came first, came fourth, it didn't matter. Because if you look at the ratings, you'll see that sometimes there are big swings from one year to the next in where, for example, a particular program or college ranks. And if there's a big swing, I mean, if you move, you know, 10 places in 1 year, it's usually because something changed. You know, the basis for the rating is usually reputation among faculty peers. That's one of the big sources of variability in ratings from year to year. And sometimes, if a particular news item caught the imagination of all the faculty, then that institute would move up in the rankings. There was a notorious case some years ago where someone did a paper that showed that even when a particular university had a disaster, because it hit the news, its rating went up. And its rating went up simply because everyone suddenly had heard of it and earlier they hadn't. So ratings have a lot to be questioned about. I personally find ratings useful if you look at them as one input and not as absolutes, and if you look at them very broadly, meaning if you say, these are the top institutes, these are the next 20 top, these are the top 20, these are the next 20, these are the next 20, that's good enough. You know, whether someone is 25 or one is 35, I wouldn't say makes any difference whatsoever.
Thank you so much, sir.
Good evening, sir. I'm Simanchal Mohanty from second year BM. So my question is, on the policy level, we are finding that regulations are being less complicated, like the government is trying to make it less complicated. At the same time, regulations are also becoming stringent. So how will these two characteristics of regulations affect the industries?
So you know, as you say, there are two parts to it. There's a lot of focus on making, it's part of the same ease of doing business thing, of making regulations supposedly less complicated. And then there's this focus on, you know, how do you ensure compliance? So on the first part, I'm fully supportive. I think it's a very good thing for us to try and do. On the second part of trying to force compliance on more and more industry and so on, I am less clear that it's going to have the benefits that we really expect of it. Let me give you one area where I think this is illustrated. If you look at there's something called the tax buoyancy ratio, which is that for every percentage of GDP growth, how much does tax collections increase? And if you look over the last 25 years, as tax rates have come down, the tax buoyancy ratio has been quite high. In fact, the tax buoyancy ratio has been around 1.5, meaning that for every 1% of GDP growth, tax collections have gone up by 1.5%. And since GDP growth has been about 7%, tax collections have been rising by about 10% year on year on year over this 25-year period, which is very, very substantial. But I think we've lost the message that the way in which that tax buoyancy and that attractive tax buoyancy has come about is by reducing raids, by reducing an intrusive state, by reducing tax rates themselves. And I think the current focus on compliance, the current focus on catching wrongdoing is not going to be as fruitful as we expect. It might make us feel better, but I don't think it will actually deliver that much tax buoyancy at the end of the day. And I think we should just learn from the experience of the last 25 years and say, how do we make it attractive for people to be tax compliant? What is it that will enable people to be tax compliant in an easy way and in a way that everyone generally seems to feel is fair? I think there's a lot of work to be done over there, and it's the one area where I think we at present are heading down the wrong path, and I think we could usefully go back to focusing on making it attractive for people to be compliant as opposed to trying to force compliance. I think that applies more generally to regulation too. That if you want to ensure that people follow the law, make it easy for people to follow the law, make it attractive for people to follow the law, instead of just trying to enforce the law. Yeah?
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
A very good evening, sir. My name is Shatam Patri, and I am from BM first year. So my question is, we seem to be comparing ourselves with China in everything that we do. But there is a very fundamental difference in the form of governments that we have. So is it feasible to compare ourselves with them?
So, earlier on, whenever we compared India with other countries, by the way, the first time that anyone senior in the government compared ourselves with another set of countries was when Manmohan Singh presented his budget in June 1991. And he compared the Indian development record. It's a great speech, by the way, one of the great speeches of all time, the 1991 budget speech. And he compared how we performed as an economy compared to, not China, because 1991 China hadn't hit the headlines then, but he compared us with all of the countries of Southeast Asia that I mentioned earlier. He compared ourselves with South Korea and Taiwan. He compared ourselves with Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. Yeah? And he drew a lot of lessons from that. But then people would always say, well, yes, but those are small countries. India is such a huge country. Okay. Then along came China, equally huge country, right? And China's development record has been quite startling. It's been most impressive in these last 30 years, 35 years, right? It's grown at an average rate of between 9 and 10% year on year for 30 years. That's a remarkable performance, about the fastest that any country has grown any time in history. So should we say now, now maybe we say, well, China is not a democracy. Okay. So maybe there are some aspects of development that we can usefully say, yeah, it's not a democracy, so therefore they can get X, Y, Z to happen faster. Such as, for example, if you all know the right of eminent domain. You want to do a particular public project, you have the right to acquire land, right, for the purpose of that public project. So China does that in a very brutal way. They've done it for years in a very brutal way, and they do it very efficiently and very fast. The project happens, the people get moved. Yeah, that's a good one to look at and say, we don't want to be like China because we don't want to impose the same kind of trampling of human rights on our population that they do. Good one to say we're a different form of government. But if you look at other things that we do, if you look at investment in education and in research, if you look at the ability to deliver high levels of literacy for the population at large, if you look at quality of secondary schools and the size of secondary schools, there are no good reasons why we as a democracy couldn't do a lot better and couldn't learn a lot from the experience of China in all those respects. No reason why we can't learn from their primary health system and what they've done to actually ensure widespread coverage around the country. So there are many areas where we can, I think, usefully learn from the Chinese experience and which have nothing to do with the form of government that it actually takes. Because no one in our system as well is against any of those things. It's just that our actual final implementation on the ground leaves a lot to be desired. I'll just quickly say, for primary education and for secondary education, we have great clarity on what the issue is and how it needs to be addressed. Right? You know, every year the NGO Pratham does an annual survey of educational outcomes in India, covering many districts in the country and so on, and they look at 14-year-olds, and can 14-year-olds do the kind of mathematics and have the kind of logic that a 14-year-old is expected to be able to do. 11-year-olds and 14-year-olds, I think. And what they always find is, very depressing. I mean, it's very worrying in terms of the results that they actually show. The recommendations are quite clear. For primary schools, what we need to do is to ensure much greater local community control of the school. Because if the local community is in control of the school, they'll ensure the teacher shows up. They'll ensure that the kids go to school and learn something from the teacher. They'll ensure that the teacher is teaching something that they feel is relevant, and when the kids come home, they're developing and learning something. For secondary schools, the solution is quite different. For secondary schools, it's clear that what we need is fewer large schools. So we don't need a school in every village, because then you end up with very small schools. And when you have small schools, then you end up with common classes. 5th, 6th, and 7th standard is merged into the same class. All the students of 5th, 6th, and 7th are in the same classroom. That's a very bad way of teaching, right? Because then you learn the same thing for 3 years running, and any smart kid is going to drop out of school because they drop out from sheer boredom. Yeah? So you say, okay, you need larger schools, so you can have more teachers in that school, fewer schools that are larger, and you don't need community involvement. You need much more state involvement and states providing higher quality, fewer high-quality large schools. So the solutions are clear. There's nothing that says that because we're a democracy, we can't bring about these changes. There are other things that we need to fix in our own system that I think can make those things happen faster. So, I've never been a subscriber of the democracy excuse for any issues that we have in the country. I think we can always do better within our existing democratic system.
Thank you, sir.
Good evening, sir. It's Bishank Panikrai. I'm BM first year. My question is regarding our bad debt. So in most of the developed
regarding
countries...
What, hello? Regarding what?
Bad debt. Bad debt.
Health tech. Okay, right.
My question is regarding bad debt. Most of the developed countries, you can see USA, China, they have 4 to 5 big banking companies, and all the companies move around that. But in India, there are so many banks, and due to that, there is an issue of bad debt. So what I'm suggesting is, should India have those 4 to 5 big companies, and all other banking companies will move around it?
So, first of all, the US banking system has not covered itself in glory in the last 10 or 15 years. And, you've heard this phrase, too big to fail, right, which was used a lot in 2008 during the global financial crisis. So I'm not sure that, do we need fewer banks? Probably so. We certainly don't need 21 public sector banks, right? Should we have fewer public sector banks? Almost surely, because there's a long tail of small public sector banks that could be merged into others quite usefully. Second, does that mean that we should overall have only 4 or 5 banks? That would worry me a lot. I think we could definitely benefit as a country, again, consistent with our diversity, with many banks. but public and private. And let the diversity show on the ground in diverse offerings from many different banks, again both public and private. So do we need fewer banks? I'd say only when it comes to the number that we have in the public sector. So the same owner, why does the same owner need 21 banks? Good question. Private banks, we need many more, if you ask me, that can also then work together with some of these public sector banks and grow offerings. We're a very unbanked country. You know, the initiative that was taken by this government to actually open bank accounts is a very powerful, useful initiative. And that initiative needs to be taken much further, where people start, as a population, we become a banked population, and a population which uses bank accounts as the way in which you store wealth. So do we need fewer banks? Probably not. We need fewer public sector banks? Probably so. But sorry, one last comment. You also mentioned that the fewer banks is that the number of banks is the reason for the NPAs. Please sit. And by the way, after you ask your question, please sit down. You don't need to stand. So especially since I give you these long answers. I don't think the number of banks that we had was related to the NPAs and the NPA issue, because some of our largest banks are as much a party to the NPA problem as the smaller banks. The big problem for NPAs was political interference. The big problem for NPAs was, phone calls that would come saying, such and such person, don't call the loan in, right? And so you just let the loan, you don't recognize the bad debt when it is a small bad debt, and you let it grow and balloon into a very big bad debt. That was the number one source for NPAs, together with, which we should never forget, together with serious problems in delivering on PPP projects, and serious problems by the state in delivering on those PPP projects. So if, for example, you're setting up a bridge, you've awarded a contract to build a bridge, and you don't provide the land on which the bridge can be built, and the years pass, and half the work has been done, and that company is financing the half that it's already built for all those years, then you have a direct culpability there in the delays in PPP projects, in actually driving those bad debts and those NPAs to start building up. So that was the source. It was political interference and delays in the execution, in the smooth execution of PPP projects. We could have done better with both.
Good evening, sir. I am Anindo Vasu from BM second year. Sir, India is not a socialist state, but we still see lots of cynicism about private sector organizations. Even though there are lots of inefficiencies in the public sector organizations, people still revere them. So what would you recommend to change the general mindset of a common man regarding this difference?
So let me give you, my favorite cartoonist was Lakshman. Who used to have this wonderful You Said It cartoon in each edition of the Times of India. And Lakshman had a cartoon once which shows all these. It shows a bunch of people in suits moving away from this table, and this minister saying to another minister, he says that, did you see how depressed and miserable that businessman looked? That shows our policy is working. So there is this attitude that has long been around of, questioning the private sector and so on. I will answer that question in two ways. First, some of that is of our own making, I think, as private sector. I think, the point that I made earlier about our need to be more ethical across industry, I think is a way in which we can raise our standing in industry, and we can then say that, listen, industry is a force for good, no qualification, right? Industry is a force for good, full stop, no qualification, no except for, right? And I think that setting our own house in order is something that we must do and we must drive in industry, within industry. Second, we have to change the terms of public debate, where wealth is respected, making wealth is respected, that just because someone has been very successful doesn't mean he's been crooked, right? If someone has been very successful, we should respect them for being very successful, full stop, right? Now, there are lines that you have to draw, right? For example, sometimes we in society look at conspicuous consumption, right? And we don't like it. So we condemn it. My view would be roughly as follows. There's sort of a hierarchy. Yeah? Conspicuous consumption might be distasteful, but it's not illegal, right? If the money was made legally, the person has the right to conspicuously consume whatever, right? I wouldn't respect the person, right, who has this incredibly flashy wedding in a relatively poor society. I wouldn't respect that person. I wouldn't admire that person. But what they're doing is not illegal, right? And we should draw those lines between what's illegal, what's distasteful, and what's admirable. And I think we should then respect and admire people. So if you like, it's a 2x2 scale, right? There's stuff that we would admire. There's stuff that we would say is legal or illegal. And you have things that you'd admire, which are legal. I don't think you'd admire anything that is illegal, right? But you have stuff that is legal that you wouldn't admire as well, and that's okay. Yeah. So I think, having one's own compass in one's head that tells one that this is what I admire, this is what I don't admire, but it's not illegal, so it's up to that individual. Let them live the life that they wish to live. But I think, a more full-blooded respect for private enterprise is something that we will end up with as a country, but we need to get there. We're some distance from it. Arvind Subramanian, the chief economic advisor in the economic survey that came out at the end of January, he talked about 3 meta-challenges for the Indian economy. And one of his 3 meta-challenges was precisely this, that we have as a society still a somewhat mixed relationship and mixed regard for private enterprise and for wealth. And it's something that we do need to address as a society. Yeah?
Good evening, sir. So my name is Sambit Chaudhary, and I'm from BM first year. So one of the common complaints against Manrega was that it drove up labor costs disproportionately for lowly skilled jobs, and it made it that difficult for small-time manufacturers and farm businesses to employ people. So in that regard, do you believe a hypothetical Universal Basic Income Act might actually hamper the country's growth opportunities?
So when Narega was launched, Surjit Bhalla, who's now part of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, wrote an editorial where he said that Narega was the second best scheme to the kind of wealth distribution that would be the best scheme. He said the best wealth distribution scheme, he said, would be to fly a helicopter over the poorest districts in India and throw rupees out of the helicopter. So he said that would be the best wealth distribution scheme that you could actually adopt as a society. The second best, he said, was Narega. Right? You should ask him what he thinks now, by the way, now that he's in the Economic Advisory Council. The point of Narega was to actually provide livelihoods for poor people across the country. In the course of doing so, it actually did end up pushing up wages. So that if you then wanted to actually hire someone, it was actually a very effective way of enforcing a minimum wage across the country. In that sense, I thought it was rather a good scheme. It's an expensive scheme, but it's a good scheme as a way of actually enforcing a minimum wage across a country in a very effective way, where if you want to then hire someone, you need to pay above that livelihood wage that NREGA would actually otherwise provide. Could you improve NREGA in terms of leakages in the system, in terms of the kind of public work undertaken and so on? No question you could. Lots of scope there. But what would be the best way of going about it? Well, that's where Arvind Subramanian floated this idea of a universal basic income, of a UBI scheme. Would a UBI scheme be good? I think there's merit in thinking about it. Shall I tell you the main criticism that people are using against UBI? The essence of UBI is that it has to replace all existing subsidy and social provisioning schemes. That's the essence of it. If you don't do that, if you have a universal basic income on top of any of the existing schemes or all of the existing schemes, it'll be a scheme that could bankrupt the country. So that's the danger, which is that because there's so much of vested interest that would want to keep particular current schemes going, like NREGA, for example, right, that there would maybe then an idea that you have universal basic income on top of that. That would be a disaster. But if you do what he's recommended, which is you replace all existing schemes with universal basic income, then it becomes much more attractive. Because then you don't provide subsidized power to farmers. You don't provide subsidized food to poor people. You instead provide them with an actual cash transfer into their bank accounts each month and leave it to them to buy food or buy power or buy whatever at the market rate. It's actually, from an economic perspective, it would be a major step forward in terms of eliminating leakages. It would be a major step forward in efficiency of distribution of social benefits around the country. The estimate is that about 40% of all that is spent gets absorbed somewhere along the way. That 40% is a huge percentage. And if it can go straight into people's accounts, it can be much more powerful. There's one over there.
Good evening, sir. Sir, I'm Shifali from BM second year. So you talked about the prospects of a labor-intensive growth in India. So my question is, don't you think due to the digital disruptions in place, for example, 3D printing, artificial intelligence, machine learning, till the time India has a ready skilled population to cater to the needs of the industry, the demand, the kind of skill the industry requires would have been changed completely?
So, so people keep asking this question, saying that, listen, there's this study that was done recently which said that 45% of total Indian manufacturing jobs, was it? Or was it higher? I can't remember recently, that said would be eliminated with new technologies, etc. I've always had the view that any of these things take time, and as you eliminate professions and jobs, you also create opportunities, new opportunities and new jobs. But as you mentioned, you need to be prepared to take advantage of those new opportunities. And that will bring us straight back to education. So 2 comments. 1, first, in terms of the jobs that we're actually worried about, I think we have to be less worried about certain jobs. So for example, self-driving cars, something that everyone talks about now. I've always had the view that the best self-driving car will be defeated by the average Delhi driver any day, at least for the foreseeable future, right? I would think at least for the next 20 years. Yeah? So I think some of those technologies we have to be less worried about in our own country, right? For all kinds of good reasons. Having said that, how do you actually equip people? Because in manufacturing, you will see jobs being eliminated. You will see great efficiency gains coming in. In the apparel industry, which has so far been a very labor-intensive industry, there are some technologies that are indeed coming in which are eliminating hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs. How do you bring about employment opportunities on a widespread scale? The only way is through education. And I think there we have to learn not from China, but from many very small countries. We can learn from, I think, particularly countries like Sweden and Singapore and some of the Scandinavian countries, which have done the most in tweaking their education systems to be able to cope with technical change. So what are the skills that people need to be comfortable with to be able to cope as these jobs start going away? And I think there are significant opportunities over there. I think what we need to do is we need to ensure some basic educational outcomes in our schools. If we get those basic educational outcomes, we will be a long way better prepared than we are now for technical change. And then second, having provided those basic educational outcomes for the great mass of the population, we need to then have many existing training institutes and so on, which can do top-up training. That you see around you today, and that will be a private entrepreneurial response to opportunity. So I think that will happen without question. The bigger question is those basic educational outcomes for 1.3 billion people, or for whatever the age group is that's, up to 16 years old. And I think ensuring that is what we should worry about as a country, because if we can address that, I think it's the best way that we will both create employment opportunities and equip people to deal with changes in technology. Yeah? That's the bit that I worry about. I don't worry about all of you coping with changes in technology. I worry about me, but I don't worry about all of you coping with changes in technology. Right? I worry about your peers who do not have these opportunities and who have come out of a school system that is very inferior.
A very good evening, sir. My name is Lakshya, BM first year student. So, sir, as you mentioned that there are a good amount of times that while implementing a plan or a scheme, there's a lot tend to be left to, desired, as something is not implemented to its best. And somehow I tend to relate it down to the point where you mentioned that we need ethical leaders in our coming future as well. So, though we know that it is needed and it is much easier said than done, do we have any kind of example where this scheme has been implemented or revolutionized on a large scale or on a big extent, so that the same can be brought down and somehow implemented in the system?
I caught the second part of your question, but what was the first part?
Sir, implementation of plans and schemes left a lot to be desired.
Implementation of schemes.
Yes.
So I think so first of all, do we need ethical leaders? Absolutely we do. I was making an argument for fixing our own house in industry, right? That we need to, in industry, be more ethical. Yeah? And the role how do companies become ethical, or how do they practice ethics in them? By having people with the right values in those companies, by articulating collectively what those values mean for how the company should operate, and then ensuring that everyone in the company lives by those values, right? So the argument that I was making about ethics is focused on companies and on industry and what we need to do in our own house in setting it in order so that we are, without qualification, respected members of society. Yeah? In terms of actual implementation of schemes, I think the solution lies elsewhere. So as a part of being CII president, you go to the government all the time. You meet secretaries and ministers across different departments. And one of the things that impressed me over these last 3 or 4 years was the competence level of secretaries in the government. Certainly, by and large, when you meet a secretary in the government of India, you meet someone who is committed and qualified for the job. There are exceptions, but by and large, you'll meet people at the highest level of government who are committed and qualified and trying to do a good job. The joint secretary level, again, significant competence. Beyond that, the competence tends to become much rockier and much less prevalent on the ground. What does that mean for our ability to implement? It means that our bandwidth to implement is relatively limited. So if our bandwidth is relatively limited, how do we get good implementation? By one source and only one source, which is focus, right? So we need to do few things and try and do those few things really well. And it's where I have some issues with the current government, because they're trying to do everything at the same time. And I think they're not recognizing that the government, and I'm not talking about this government, all governments, this government, previous government, government before that, has limited management bandwidth. It has limited bandwidth and ability to implement. And if you have limited ability to implement, then try to do a few things at a time, ensure that they actually happen on the ground in depth and in a solid and robust way, and then move on to other things. I think we've tried to do too many things, and as a result of trying to do too many things, we've done too little at too many things because of this bandwidth issue, not because of a desire to implement, not because of the scheme itself was wrong. The scheme was right, the desire was there, but the ability to implement was limited, and we didn't focus. Yeah, so I think, so if you ask me about implementation, I would say that point on focus. By the way, it applies for us in our companies. When we want to get a lot done, do fewer things, right? Because if you want to do a lot, do less. Right? There's some Chinese proverb or something that says that. Okay. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. My name is Sankalp Anukul, and I'm from BM first year. The current government is trying to cut down on red tape, and one of the reasons for that is it is trying to attract foreign investments. But at the same time, there's a lot of hue and cry from startups like Flipkart and Ola, which are saying that competition from abroad will suffocate them because they don't have that much financial backing. So what is the way forward?
So our stance as a country should be broadly to be open to foreign investment, to attract anyone from anywhere in the world and encourage them to come here, and we should learn from them, let them learn from us, and we should compete with them. But what should the government do? It should make it easy for firms to operate in the country, the same ease of doing business point. What can a state government do? It can go a very long way to make it cheap and easy to do business in the local area and in the state. And the more we do that, the more we will make it easy for our own smaller local firms to compete with the larger foreign firms or large domestic firms for that matter. What do large firms have that small firms don't? They have more than anything else resources, as you mentioned, but they have resources which they use to manage the system. They have, if you have a very cumbersome, a lot of red tape, you need to deal with the red tape. You need to get the permissions. You need patience to deal with all of those permissions, etc. If you can address that, you will help small firms, relatively speaking, much more than large firms, which is why I've always argued that the best way of helping small firms is not to have a policy for small firms. The best way of helping small firms is ease of doing business. The best way of helping small firms is actually improve the business climate such that it's cheap and easy for every firm to do business in the country. You'll help small firms, relatively speaking, much more than large firms, and enable them to compete with the largest firm from wherever.
Hello, good evening, sir. So my question is, if large corporates or private parties lead the way in agriculture, can they create sustainability in the long term?
Sustainability in agriculture. Now you're asking me about subjects that I know nothing about. The only thing that I will say is what I've heard over the last year or so in CI from colleagues who know much more about agriculture and agricultural industry. One of the arguments that people have made is that one of the ways in which we can best foster agricultural growth in the country is by allowing contract farming and land leasing on a more widespread basis in different states. That if we do that, we can actually build then a greater efficiency in our agricultural system and bring new technologies and higher yields to our agricultural produce. Yeah? That's from a productivity and economic success perspective. From a sustainability perspective, the only thing I'll say is that from a technical perspective, you can again bring in those practices if you have a certain amount of scale. But keeping that in mind, I have a friend who has a farm in California. He's actually a designer, he's a product designer, and somewhere along the way he decided that he became actually a product designer focused on sustainability and sustainability practice at a leading design consultancy. And then at some point in time, he decided the best way to actually understand sustainability was to become a farmer. Because if you farm, you learn the essence of what it means to preserve your resources such that the next year is as good as the current year and 10 years out is as good or better than the current year. And that focus on sustainability has been quite interesting to see what he's done. He now doesn't use a tractor. He has 4 horses, and he uses those 4, this is at a farm in California, by the way, and he uses those 4 horses to actually plow his fields, to harvest, etc. And then he hires a few extra people at the time of harvest, and that's about it. But otherwise, he looks after this farm of, I don't know, 60 acres or 80 acres entirely on his own, right, with the help of these 4 horses and his wife, who complains a lot about this lifestyle choice that he's made. So how do you bring about a true understanding of sustainability? I think it's something that we have to constantly work at. I'm not clear that hybrids and electric vehicles are necessarily the only way to go for a more sustainable future. They might be, but I think it's a good debate to actually have. Are we clear that we have a way in which of disposing of the batteries that all of these vehicles are going to actually contain? Are we clear that the best way of actually having more sustainable transport is to have new cars versus continuing to use old cars for longer? I'm not so sure. So I think these are the kinds of things that we should actually get into a good discussion around. I don't have the answers, but I would love to hear the debate around them. Yeah. All set.
Perhaps we can take one last question. And if there is no last question, would one of our professors like to ask a question or pose a question to Professor Naushad Forbes?
So I have a question, if you don't
ahead.
mind taking. That last question probably. Okay. Sir, I find that Indians who graduate out of international B schools have a higher probability of getting into the CXO roles and probably into the board as well in the early part of their career. While I don't find the same happening with Indian management graduates who graduate out of Indian B schools. So is there a gap in the kind of education that is imparted between both the systems, or is it because of the industry structure that we have in US vis-a-vis that in India?
So you're saying, are you saying Indian graduates versus international graduates in Indian companies or in foreign companies?
Indians who graduate out of international B schools versus Indians who graduate from Indian B schools.
Yes, but in terms of
getting into the CXO roles in the early
CXO
part
roles,
of
but CXO roles in India or internationally?
Internationally.
Internationally. I think, I think you'll find, I don't know if there's any data that actually shows what you're saying. I would question it, actually. I would say that the spread of achievement in any such area is going to be greater than any differences in average, right? So, you know, you'll have more than enough CXOs around the world of some of the world's leading companies who've come out of Indian institutes. I mean, have come out of some institutes that we will all know and all respect in the country, and some that you will probably never have heard of or will have heard of for the first time because you hear that this person graduated from there. So I think you have this spread of achievement which depends at the end of the day very much on the individual and what they do. I wouldn't say that international, that international graduates are in any way better than graduates in the country. It depends on the individual at the end of the day, and you can recruit and find great individuals across the country in many, many institutes. Does that mean that we could do a better job of, you know, our own education system, creating more opportunities, including opportunities to network and so on? I'm sure we can, but I would encourage looking at actual opportunities that one has. I think one has those opportunities regardless of which institute one comes out from. I think it depends much more on the individual at the end of the day than anything else.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Naushad.
Yeah?
So, that's been a truly outstanding, I think, interaction and address as well. And may I request everybody to please join me in giving him a really big hand. Thank you, Naushad. Truly outstanding. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your inspiring thoughts and insightful words. Indeed, your views are well taken and much appreciated by all of us here today. As a token of our appreciation and gratitude, I request Shri Rajiv Kaul and Father Paul Fernandez to felicitate our chief guest, Dr. NAUSHAD FORBES. I would now like to request Father Paul Fernandez to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening to all, and it's been a very wonderful, joyful moment, especially to remember the foundation of this institute. In 1987, on the 12th of October, the doors of this institution were open to students. So the real foundation of love and prayer and friendship and future of this institute lies in the love with which we welcome the students on this campus. And therefore, on this day, as Professor and Dr. NAUSHAD FORBES reminded us, really the great institutions have great students. So in the Jesuit tradition, the learner is the center of the universe, so we keep learning. And in a very special way, therefore, on this day, for reminding us of our core beliefs and values, I would like all of us to stand and once again give Dr. NAUSHAD FORBES our congratulations and thanks. May I also ask you to stand up for a moment. We have our chairman, Sri Rajiv Kaul, who has been chairman for 17 years of our 30 years of XIM. Rajiv. Really thank you for guiding us through this.
It's been a pleasure,
years.
Father.
Yes.
I've been getting younger and younger.
Yes.
Thanks to the youngsters here.
Youngsters. Yes. Yes. You know, on this Foundation Day, our sentiments are full of gratitude, and we look forward to not only giving thanks to all those who contributed in immense ways to the success of this institution in the last 30 years, but we also look forward to the Board of Governors, who are, some of them are here with us, and some are at large. They have been always a constant support for me to take the right directions for the Institute and the university. I thank the faculty, I thank my registrar and the deans and for their active role in implementing everything and working together in so pleasant ways to take this institution forward. I also thank all the Jesuit brothers who are here, my colleagues. You know, we have wide arms to embrace almost everything to take it forward. The good, bad, and finally the responsibility is on our shoulders. We take it joyfully as a community. So I thank them also on this day. And I thank the government for all the support it has extended to us. I thank all the wonderful, always the distinguished guests who share this moment with us. I also have with us our alumni. Some of them are here. Thank you very much for sharing this Foundation Day. Also thank all the staff and who worked for this event also. Thank you very much. And I have our media students from the media group who broadcasted this event on YouTube. Thank you so much. Thank you. You know, it's the students who have, what you saw is all done by students, our own students, okay? So thank you very much, and appreciate all what you have done to take this institution forward, and look forward to your collaborative endeavors together with us. Thank you, and God bless you. One last thanks for all those who asked the interesting questions, okay? And really thank you for making this evening so pleasant to listen. And through your questions, bringing out the best in NAUSHAD Forbes, he had to respond to you in so delightful ways. Thank you, NAUSHAD once again. Yes, thank you. God bless you. Let's have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. May I request the gathering to rise for the national anthem.
जनगण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड़ उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्छल जलधि तरंगा तब शुभ नामे जागे तब शुभ आशीष मांगे गाए तब जय गाथा जन गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे
Ladies and gentlemen, now we have come to the end of the Foundation Day lecture. I request all the people to be seated till the dignitaries leave. Please help yourselves with the refreshments served outside the auditorium.